Most importantly, the island could be defended. Guam, the largest of all Pacific islands between Japan and New Guinea, is 34 miles long and irregularly shaped, spanning 228 square miles from Retidian Point in the north to the very southern shoreline. The island's mountains reach more than 500 feet, and coral reefs encircle it. There weren't many miles of asphalt roads on Guam prior to World War I. The dirt roads would turn to mud as soon as the rainy season started in July. In addition to being typhoon season, July would have exceptionally high tides. Guam was the second island to be invaded in July 1944. The American progress against Japan depended heavily on the Marianas Island chain. The islands would develop into important naval and aviation stations under American control. Before the war, Guam was also an American territory. Despite not being U.S. citizens, the island's 22,290 inhabitants, 1940 census, lived under the American flag when it was won from Spain in the 1898 war and confirmed by treaty in 1901. Guam's Japanese occupiers. The inhabitants complained about living under enemy control when Japan seized the island on December 10, 1941. The island's farmers were treated like slaves laboring in the rice fields when the Japanese seized their land. The Guamanians were encouraged to erect defenses against American attacks as the battle dragged on. Although they only dispatched 300 soldiers in an advance unit, the Japanese intended to relocate the 13th Infantry Division, which had a lot of experience, from China to the Marianas. Then, under Lieutenant General Takeshi Takashima, they gave the Marianas command of the 29th Infantry Division, which was a component of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Major General Kiyoshi Shigematsu's 29th Infantry Division was also dispatched by the Japanese. This was split into two divisions, the 10th Independent Mixed Regiment, which had 1,900 men, and the 48th Independent Mixed Brigade, which had 2,800 soldiers. Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata, who was on an inspection mission on Palau when he found out that the Americans were attacking Saipan, assumed command of the Marianas while serving with the 31st Army. He immediately hurried back, but he was only able to reach Guam, where he remained under Takashima's command. The 54th K-Battalion, a unit of 3,000 naval combat men, commanded by Captain Yukata Sugimoto, was another Imperial Navy force stationed on Guam. In addition, the Japanese had 2,000 members of the Naval Air Force and 1,800 members of two infantry-capable naval construction battalions. The island was once home to 80 fighters and 80 bombers, but all of them were lost. Only 19,000 of the 35,000 personnel in total could be considered first-line combat troops. A formidable arsenal of weapons, including 580 machine guns and dozens of heavy artillery and howitzers, was part of the static defenses. Stevedore Operation. The 3rd Amphibious Corps, led by Marine Major General Roy Geiger, a 59-year-old veteran of Guadalcanal, oversaw the ground troops, while Rear Admiral Richard L. Connolly and Task Force 53 controlled the American naval forces. Connolly, 52, was referred to as Close-In Connolly because of his dedication to providing tight naval support for invasions. He had led invasion forces in Sicily. Major General Alan Turnage's 3rd Marine Division, which had fought on Bougainville, served as the Corps' spearhead. The 3rd, 9th, and 21st Marines were among its 3 regiments, totaling WW2 Leathernecks. Brig. General Lemuel Shepard's 1st Marine Provisional Brigade, which included the 4th and 22nd Marine Regiments, was the other Corps asset. During their training in Samoa, the 22nd had a filariasis outbreak that resulted in 1,800 transfers. Although there was no official backup for the 2 Marine battalions, the Army thought that the 77th Metropolitan Infantry Division, which was initially drawn from New York City, and the 27th Infantry Division, which was tasked with invading Tinian, would be used as backups. In the end, Major General Andrew Bruce's 77th was called up for Guam. Operation Stevedore, the tactical plan for the invasion of Guam, was written in April 1944. It scheduled the invasion for June 18th, but because of the fierce battle on Saipan, the attack was delayed for a month. The United States knew relatively little about Guam, despite the fact that it had been an American colony for 40 years. Geiger requested that submarine patrols get in touch with Guamanians in order to provide them with the most recent information regarding Japanese deployments. They turned down his plea. Until the assault started, or even later, the Americans would not have accurate maps of Guam. For their invasion plans, the Americans went for boldness and simplicity. Tumen Bay, north of Agana, was the ideal location for a landing on Guam. The Japanese fiercely defended the bay since both the Americans and the Japanese were aware of this. Instead of Japanese gunfire, Geiger had to deal with shallow sea and vast coral reefs. The 1st Marine Brigade would rush ashore on the beaches of Agat, enclosing the Opera Harbor and securing the Orote Peninsula, while the 3rd Marine Division would launch an offensive at Agana. Reaching the shores. The Navy crushed the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and started to erode the Guam defenders as the Marines practiced the invasion. On June 16th, the Navy started shelling Guam. Connolly determined that W Day would be July 21st, and H hour would be 8:30 a.m. after checking the weather. On July 15, the assault force departed Eniwetok Atoll for Guam, arriving on schedule. On W Day, the weather was ideal, clear with a little cloud cover and a light wind. The Leathernecks loaded onto their landing craft early on the 21st. At 5:30 a.m., air assistance joined the overwhelming bombardment launched by Navy warships. The attack forces were in place about 6 in the morning. At 8:03 a.m., the Navy started bombarding the beach. With the 3rd Marine Regiment crashing ashore at Red Beach 1, the 21st at Green Beach in the middle, and the 9th Marines on Blue Beach, the major Marine onslaught was focused on the 2,000 yards of landing beach between Asen Point and Adelup Point. The 4th Marines and the 22nd Marines were to strike Beaches Yellow 1 and 2 and White Beaches 1 and 2, respectively, south of the Orote Peninsula. Little opposition to the initial landings at Asan was anticipated by the Americans. They went back to their posts and started firing at the 1st Provisional Brigade after the shelling stopped. Nevertheless, the landings in Asan were successful. The Leathernecks were on the move in 40 minutes. There were 231 dead and wounded in the 3rd Marine Regiment. The firefight intensified as the Marines advanced inland. The flamethrowers joined the assault, and the Shermans of the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion waddled up to assist the riflemen. Chonito Cliff was soon captured. Additionally, machine gun fire caused problems for the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. The battalion's A Company's captain, Giri Bunshu, attempted but failed to flank the position. He asked for and was denied permission to withdraw. Instead, a 2nd direct attack was ordered by the regiment. The attack caused Bunshu to fall, and his company spent the entire day held down. The Marines used hand grenades to silence the machine guns after all weapons had fired. Determinate defense also halted the 2-3 Marines. The hill was quickly given the moniker Bunshu Ridge by the Marines. Taking Agate. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade encountered heavy enemy fire and a broad coral reef at Agate Beach. Hills and caverns shielded the Japanese from the low-trajectory naval weapons. The 38th Regiment of Japanese soldiers bombarded white and yellow beaches with rifle and machine gun fire. Japanese fire was directed at invading landing vehicles that were stuck up on the coral reef. The 22nd Marines surged ashore as planned, with DUKWs bringing in Sherman tanks despite the intense fire. Against intermittent opposition, these rumbled toward Agate Village and smashed open strongpoints. Additionally, the 4th Marines landed on time and were hit by heavy fire. Japanese fire from a hill not on their charts stopped the 2-4 Marines, who were trapped down until noon. After taking refuge in a drainage ditch, the 1-4 Marines regrouped and routed the Japanese. At noon, General Shepard personally landed, recognizing the urgency of the situation. His men were thirsty, weary, and lacking in water and ammunition despite their victories. There was a complete breakdown of communication. Chaos could result from a Japanese counterattack. With tank backup, the 122 Marines advanced through the agate debris at 12:45 p.m. and captured the town. The final charge of Suenaga. The Japanese machine gunners were too resolute to dislodge the Marines as they moved east to take control of a hill. Despite air support, the 4th Marines did not fare much better. Shepard told his soldiers to dig in because he anticipated the Japanese would start fierce nighttime counterattacks as sunset approached. Shepard was correct. Although Takashima was preparing night counterattacks, his plans lacked coherence and his soldiers had sustained significant losses. At 5:30 p.m., Colonel Tsumetaro Suenaga intended to dispatch 2 battalions to the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade. Takashima initially demurred, then he consented. Suenaga gave the order to have his regimental colors burned prior to the invasion, indicating that his command would be decimated. At 11:30 p.m., a massive mortar assault on the 4th Marines' right flanks initiated the offensive. The 4 Marines were struck by Japanese soldiers with 4 clanking T-97 tanks 30 minutes later. In response, the Americans fired 75mm shells and bazookas from their Sherman tanks, igniting the rivet-hulled T-97s and halting the assault. At 3:30 a.m., the Japanese made another attempt, this time under Suenaga's leadership. After being struck by a piece of mortar, he continued to charge until a rifle bullet killed him. Star shells from the Navy and Marines lit up the area. The Marines pondered whether their adversaries were intoxicated. Later, they discovered liquor-filled caverns. Although there were fewer strikes in the 3rd Marine Division sector, one did strike the 303 Marines at midnight, where PFC Kentucky's Luther Skaggs Jr. was defending a stance. In his foxhole, a Japanese grenade detonated. Rather than summoning a medical professional, Skaggs used a tourniquet and stood his ground for the next 8 hours. On June 15, 1945, President Harry S. Truman awarded Skaggs the Medal of Honor. The Bunshu Ridge Take. Chaos quickly erupted when the 305th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Vincent Tanzola, began to arrive on shore. The landing craft hovered around in the tropical heat, troops getting tired and seasick, because Shepard did not want the 305, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Adair, to come ashore. Under heavy fire and carrying 50 pounds of equipment, they eventually made their landing on White Beach 1 at 2 p.m. The 1-305 struggled more. It was detained in its landing craft until 5:30 p.m. under Lieutenant Colonel James Landrum. In the middle of the night, the 305 finally landed. In addition to missing their beach guides, the 305 had to deal with malfunctioning compasses, boats that went off course, and passing over the reef. It took some of the men till 6 in the morning to reach ashore. The 1st Marine Provisional Brigade tallied the Japanese casualties close to their front line when daylight broke on July 22nd. One unit had over 390 reported, another had 200, and a third had 69. The Japanese had obviously suffered a significant loss. Shigematsu reasoned that he needed to use artillery and mortars to hold the 3rd Marine Division in check at Asan. The 3rd Division message center was directly hit by his gunners. Japanese infiltrators were thwarted in their attempt to breach the barrier separating the 3rd and 21st Marine Regiments. 1-3 Marines were ordered to attack Bunshu Ridge after the onslaught was repulsed, but they once more failed to capture it during the initial assault. By shifting 2 companies to flank the Japanese on the ridge and attacking squarely in front of them, the Marines altered their strategy. Company C of the 1-3 headed around to the right as the attack began around 10 a.m. They were halted by Japanese fire. Companies A and E, supported by tanks, half-tracks, and mortars, advanced directly toward the ridge. This attack was successful. The Marines arrived at the ridge's summit, the Kentucky Marine PFC. For his bravery throughout the action, Leonard Mason was awarded the Medal of Honor. The Marines were too few to hold the area, even though they captured the ridge. On July 22nd, the 3rd Marines lost 615 men. 1-3 Marine Company A has lost its effectiveness. The 9th Marines captured the former Pity Island Navy Yard with little opposition, while the 21st Marines had an easier difficulty deploying patrols, bringing the invasion force back into order. Under intense naval fire, 3-9 was loaded into LVTs and sent to capture the tiny Cabras Island off the coast in the early afternoon. It became out that Cabras had little defense. Meanwhile, Shepard battled to bring his disorganized command back into shape in the sector of the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade. Because of its careless unloading, the 305th was in poor condition. Positioning it to relieve the 2-4 Marines took the entire morning. In an attempt to cut off the Orote Peninsula, the 22nd Marines launched an offensive from positions north of Agat toward Old Agat Road. Mount Alifan was approached by the 4th Marines. After reaching the crest, the 1-4 decided it would be too risky to remain there in case the Japanese launched a counterattack and retreated to a more defendable position. Takashima hesitated once more that night, unwilling to launch a significant counteroffensive. He was adamant on retaining the old U.S. pre-war Marine barracks and a route airfield. Meanwhile, beginning at noon on the 23rd, Geiger made the decision to land the 306th Infantry on White Beach. The Army personnel encountered another problem when the 306th entered. Their DUKWs and LVTs were unable to traverse the coral reefs. Bulldozers were required to drag vehicles ashore. Army General Bruce expressed dissatisfaction with the treatment of his men and asked that his final regiment land and be placed under his command as a single unit rather than as an attachment to Shepard's brigade. Despite his reluctance, Geiger made the decision to land his floating reserve on the 24th. Along with the suffering of a storm at sea that caused seas, the 307th's experience going ashore was comparable to that of the other 2 regiments. The Marines pushed through hills, bogs, and rice paddies, while the GIs experienced seasickness. Japanese defenses at Monotenjo were blasted by numerous 14-inch shells fired from the Pennsylvania. 50% power. Shepard and the 22nd Marines were now ready to cut off Japanese forces on the Orote Peninsula. The attack on July 24th was supported by tank support, airstrikes, and naval barrages. Japanese caverns were blocked off, and obstacles were blasted by the covering fire. The American Shermans quickly destroyed the 5 tanks the Japanese put in. However, after 4 days of combat, the 1st Brigade had 188 dead in action and 1,003 injured. The 3rd Marines launched an attack on the Japanese right flank on July 23rd with the help of division and corps artillery as well as aviation. The Japanese had largely abandoned Bunshu Ridge as the 2-3 Marines attempted to flank it. A company was down to 40 men as the Japanese launched a counterattack against 3-3, and its captain alerted his superiors to the dire situation of his troops. In an attempt to tie up their exposed flanks and reach Fonte Plateau, the Marines launched another offensive on July 24th with the 21st and 3rd. The 9th Marines attempted to connect with the 1st Brigade to the south. The Japanese appeared to be leaving defensive positions, but it was unsuccessful. With the arrival of water tanks, defense battalions, and combat engineer CBs on July 25th, the Americans were starting to solve their supply and organization issues. Despite a friendly fire incident that claimed 15 Marine deaths, the 2-9 launched an effective attack on Fonte Plateau around 9:30 a.m. that day. 250 dead Japanese were discovered lying in their ravine as the 221 and 321 Marines advanced behind pulverizing air and artillery support. The 9th Marines performed better, seizing many undamaged supply dumps and gaining high ground north of the Aguada River. They discovered large amounts of soft drinks and Asahi beer in the trash, but the 3rd Marine Division was maintaining a 9,000-yard line, which was a significant distance for the exhausted force. Shepard's units were reduced to half their former strength. Guam must be defended to the death. Even though July 25th was supposed to be a day for the invaders to regroup and recuperate, Shepard continued to fight as he attempted to block off the Orote Peninsula's neck in the face of Japanese pillboxes, bunkers, and additional tanks. Under Commander Asaichi Tamai, the 54th Keibutai Naval Forces made up the majority of the defenders. 8 Japanese Type 97 tanks were lost as a result of their inability to handle the American M4 Shermans with their 47mm guns. There were now about 2,500 Japanese soldiers stranded on the peninsula. Tamai understood that his only option was to join Takashima in a nighttime banzai charge with all of his soldiers. Every weapon his ammo officers could find, he distributed. In order to boost the men's bravery for the big attack, he then distributed all of the beer, sake, and fake scotch on the peninsula. Fortunately for Tamai and his shaky plans, Takashima was preparing the same thing, coordinating his 1,000 men's enormous nighttime attack with Tamai's. Although it didn't seem like a good plan, Tokyo radioed Takashima on the 24th. "Defend Guam to the death. We think there will be excellent news soon." Takashima then organized the 48th Brigade and the 18th Regiment. Under Lieutenant-Colonel Robert Cushman, they would launch their attack on 2-9 from the Fonte Plateau and travel all the way to Red Beach 2. In the meantime, two 18th Regiment battalions would strike the 21st Marines, while another battalion would strike the 9th Marines' left wing. They would exploit the 800-yard distance between the two Marine units by using the narrow valleys of the Asan and Nidwal rivers. The Marianas Turkey Shoot of the Marines. On the afternoon of the 25th, heavy rain started to fall from the Guam sky. In flooded foxholes, leathernecks and GIs huddled. Unseen, the Japanese gathered to oppose the 3rd Marine Division. However, the majority of the naval attackers appeared to be intoxicated, and the attack on the 1st Provisional Brigade proceeded horribly. Their white outfits made them quite conspicuous in the darkness as they pushed forward. The Marine artillery soon saw the area illuminated by star shells. A large number of Japanese soldiers escaped into wetlands. Amazingly, they rallied and launched a second attack on the 1st Brigade. One Marine platoon discovered 256 Japanese dead in front of its positions without losing a single leatherneck, which the Marines dubbed their own rendition of the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Marines were happy to save their own lives by allowing the survivors to escape behind a shell curtain after the attacks failed. For a loss of only 75 Marines, Dawn discovered 400 Japanese sailors dead on the field and another 600 dead or injured. At midnight, the Japanese launched their attack from the north. To repel the attacks, the Marines relied on marksmanship, discipline, and training. A 2,000-yard front, typically held by 600 soldiers, was held by just 250 men on the 121. Turnage gave the order for the soldiers in his motor pool, engineers, headquarters, and service to prepare to proceed to the front. Major Chusa Maruyama was instructed via signal flares to lead his 218 Regiment against the American 121 Marines at one of their weakest spots on July 26 at 3 a.m. The attackers were mowed down by the American machine guns in the light of the signal flares. The waves of Japanese attacks reduced the 21st Marine Line to huddles of troops attempting to maintain their positions and survive. A second ineffective attack. Under the command of Major Setsuo Yokioka, 318 Regiment made up the second part of Takashima's attack. A Marine counterattack prevented them from capturing two machine gun positions. The Japanese seized the high ground by swarming through the half-mile gap between the 9th and 21st Marines. With the support of chefs, bakers, clerks, and other Marines from the rear area, Colonel Wendell Duplantis, the commander of the defenders, organized 3 platoons of his weapons company to confront the Japanese and prepared to smash his cipher equipment. Everyone in the 3rd Division was shocked when some of Yukioka's men managed to enter the headquarters area, but the men from the 3rd Motor Transport Battalion and headquarters grabbed their firearms. At 6:30 a.m., some Japanese intruded into the division's hospital sector after they had successfully repelled the attack. Doctors, corpsmen, and less badly injured people were still present, and they repelled the Japanese. The majority of the seriously injured had been evacuated to the shore. Takashima's armor became lost in the darkness and was unable to engage the Americans, negating the Japanese advantage of charging from high terrain at night into gaps in the American lines. Even worse, the widespread distribution of wine, sake, and beer boosted the spirits of the Japanese soldiers, but it also undermined discipline. 90% of the Japanese officers who took part in the raid were either dead or seriously injured by morning. Takashima's counterattack claimed 4 lives. The Japanese survivors reacted in a normal way, facing inevitable defeat and unsure of what to do. They removed their helmets, set primed explosives atop their heads, put them back on, and bided their time till the inevitable happened. Low on ammunition, the 3rd Marines and 2 to 9 Marines were attacked 7 times by the 48th Brigade on the far left of the American beachhead. Captain Lewis Wilson, in charge of Company F, 9th Marines, led his forces in combat against the Japanese in the vicinity. For his bravery in the face of fire, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Not only did Wilson survive this combat, but he also remained in the Marines and served from 1975 to 1979 as the 26th Commandant of the Corps. The 48th Brigade suffered almost 950 casualties as a result of its unsuccessful counterattacks. Japanese operations and tactics were careless. For instance, they took the majority of the 21st Marines' mortars and ammo, but did not use them against the Americans. The Japanese did not destroy the mortars as the Marines launched a counterattack to retake their territory. At dawn, exhausted Marines were in control of the battlefield, evacuating their injured and examining the more than 3,500 Japanese corpses that were piled up. There were 645 wounded and 166 dead Marines. Geiger decided to take it slow. At around 1 p.m., he walked ashore and gave his soldiers orders to strengthen the perimeter, string barbed wire to prevent further attacks, and bring up more ammo. Takashima and his crew, on the opposite side, went over the outcome of their fruitless assault. Up to 95% of the attacking officers were dead. Even worse was the destruction of 90% of the weaponry. He had lost over 4,000 men. Now, as the Americans proceeded inland, the only goal of the conflict would be to harm them. The Guam campaign was decided by Takashima's counterattack. The Orote Peninsula's capture. Assuming the opposition still possessed formidable resources, Geiger had to keep up his onslaught. After reviewing his maps and casualty reports, Geiger made the decision to hold off on committing the 77th Division until the front line was secured, the Orote Peninsula was conquered, and the Fonte Plateau was taken. Destroying the Japanese defenses on the Orote Peninsula was the first task. Shepard and the 4th Marines on the left and the 22nd Marines on the right were assigned to this task. The Army's 902nd Artillery was to provide deep support for the attack, firing the first of almost 1,000 rounds at 7 a.m. on July 26th. Marine and naval artillery were mentioned by the Americans. The 22nd's advance was halted by Japanese artillery and mortar fire as it was routed up the Agate-Sumai Road. Light opposition was encountered by the 4th Marines as they advanced on the right. Tanks were brought up by the Americans after the Japanese bombarded the Marines with mortar and machine gun fire. After pushing past the Japanese fortifications, the tanks discovered another line of pillboxes and dugouts immediately east of the former Marine barracks location. Despite having a simpler day, the 4th Marines encountered many Japanese banzai strikes. Strangely, after midnight, Japanese defenders broke and fled rather than assembling for a suicide assault, a rare sight. When the offensive restarted on the 29th, the 22nd discovered the enemy in front of them crumbling. By midday, the Leathernecks had taken over the former Marine barracks and relocated to the Sumay suburbs. The 4th Marines, however, had a more difficult day. They engaged in combat against formidable defensive lines and through dense foliage. Leastes Cole Nay Alan Shapley, the commander of the 4th Marines, requested tank support from Shepard while he was on a frontline visit. Shepard requested an equal number of Army Sherman tanks from Bruce and sent up 2 platoons of Marine Sherman tanks. Bruce dutifully sent up his M5 Stuart light tanks, even though he had merely landed them. Without delay, the tank infantry squads began grinding down Japanese positions. Shepard launched a heavy naval and artillery barrage at dawn on the 29th. Shepard found every tank he could, including M10 tank destroyers, to reinforce the Leathernecks when they launched their attack at 8 a.m. The airfield was taken by noon. Attack on the line of Japan. While 322 cleared the final resistance, 122 and 222 were placed in reserve with the Orote Peninsula and victory secured. The victory was formally declared by the 222 on the afternoon of the 29th. An honor guard from 222 erected Old Glory above the ruined remnants of the pre-war Marine barracks, with Shepard, Geiger, Howlin' Mad Smith, and Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance in attendance. 38. Americans went lost, 721 were injured, and 116 were killed at the Orote Peninsula. About 2,500 Japanese soldiers lost their lives. The 3rd Marine Division was overworked, lacking in manpower and munitions, and everyone needed a break. Geiger was desperate to reclaim the initiative and ordered his men into a heavy assault against the Japanese line because he thought that the Japanese night attack of the 26th was the final offensive shot in the Nipponese locker. The 3rd Marine Division launched a wide-ranging onslaught from Fonte in the north to Mount Tenjo in the south on the morning of the 27th. With its radio towers and main north-south power line, the 21st gained the lead in the middle and drove on the high ground. Japanese machine gun fire and swampy terrain delayed the 221, necessitating tank movement across the wetlands to breach the positions. 221 was only a short distance from the power lines by late afternoon. Japanese forces entrenched in, along the slopes of a small hill, prevented the 121 from having a more difficult day. The Japanese refused to back down, despite the American tanks, guns, and aircraft. Despite encountering less opposition, the 3-21 on the right flank was delayed as it attempted to maintain contact with the Leathernecks on the left. 2-3 saw moderate opposition while avoiding enemy strongholds at the Fonte Plateau. Due to friendly fire, the 2-9 also had a difficult day. After rearranging for an hour, it arrived at its section of the power lines around mid-afternoon. 11 Fonte Plateau counterattacks. After reviewing his charts, Geiger gave the order for the other Marines to advance in their sectors and for the Fonte Plateau, which had been taken on the 28th. With the support of the Army's 3-307, the 9th Marines launched an assault on Mont Chachao Ma Alutom, line up against the typical Resolute barrier. Even tiny Leatherneck patrols working into the pit were stopped by fire from several locations, as 2-3 and 2-9 pushed on the left flank of the Fonte Plateau and moved into a wide dip known to the Marines as the Pit. Colonel Cushman postponed the attack with Turnage's consent so he could raise rocket launchers, flamethrowers, and heavy demolition charges to the pit. Cushman opened up into the pit with crisscrossing fire at the crack of morning on the 29th. Following the bombardment, Marine assault troops arrived with the directive to eliminate all remaining Japanese. There were no casualties among the Marines as they cleaned the pit. Before reaching their goals, the 9th and 21st Marines also resumed their advance and encountered only intermittent enemy fire. Two of the 2-9's rifle companies had suffered 75% casualties, while the 3rd had suffered 50%. Given the significance of retaining Fonte Plateau, Takashima defended resolutely, launching 11 unsuccessful counterattacks that lost him at least 800 valuable troops. Takashima's murder. The majority of the Army's 77th Division, however, waited for their chance to join the fight. The men were physically stranded in the muddy terrain, but they were eager to proceed after recovering from their seasickness. Geiger created his strategy for Guam's ultimate liberation. Driving north was the main task. The 1st Marine Brigade would be sweeping up the last Japanese relics on the southern half of the island, while the 77th would be on the right and the 3rd Marine Division on the left. While the Army's 305th Infantry Regiment started moving toward Mont Tenjo, the 3rd Marine Division started to struggle toward Fonte Plateau. At 8:30 a.m. on July 28th, Company A of 3305 arrived at the summit of Mount Tenjo. Phase 1 of the Guam operation was finished when the 2-307 took control and consolidated, connecting with the 3rd Marine Division on the left. Of the 733 American casualties, 5 and 13 were killed in action, the majority of whom were Marines. The 77th Division was in great condition, the 3rd Marine Division was 80% efficient, and the Provisional Brigade claimed 75% efficiency. The estimated number of Japanese fatalities was 4,192. Takashima personally assumed responsibility for the Fonte Plateau's defense on the 28th. Takashima gave the order for his forces to retreat and regroup north of the Agana River after the position was lost. The general and his group were apprehended by Marine machine gunners, who then started shooting. Takashima passed away right away. candy, and salmon on the 307th. Guam's defenses were commanded by Obata at the top of the chain. He now had to lead the whole 31st Army, which was responsible with defending the Marianas, as well as the men on the island as the senior Japanese leader. He quickly established his headquarters at Ordo, a town in central Guam. In order to create a motley force, he gathered together the remaining 1,000 combat men, 800 naval infantry, 2,500 support personnel, 12 tanks, and a few cannons. Obata gave the order to retreat to Mount Santa Rosa in order to set up two blocking positions, one close to Barrigada Hamlet and the other near Finagayan. The Japanese would use a series of delaying actions with minor units as their defense. The extent of the Japanese problems, however, was unknown to the Americans. Geiger made the cautious decision. The Americans were prepared after 2 days of putting troops into position, distributing ammo, and drawing out documents. The 77th would need to push across the island's waist and realign its regiments into position, while the 3rd Marine Division would need to move slightly to prepare for an attack. The Army targeted Barrigada and Minute Santa Rosa, while the Marines targeted Tian Airfield and Finagayan. Japanese fortifications were bombarded by Army, Marine, and Navy artillery during the evening of July 30-31. The Marines encountered intermittent fire and enemy mines when they commenced their offensive at 6:30 a.m. 4 hours later, the Leathernecks were inside Agana. By midday, the Marines had taken control of the whole town. The capital of Guam was severely destroyed and teeming with mines and booby traps when the Leathernecks arrived. The Marines advanced quickly in the face of little resistance. The 21st reached its goal line about 2 p.m. after a brief skirmish with an enemy pillbox. A few Japanese guarding a supply dump close to Ordo and challenging terrain slowed the 9th's advance. Marine bazookas destroyed the 2 tanks they used in their counterattack. It wasn't until late afternoon that the 77th encountered no opposition while driving across the waste of Guam. Bruce took advantage of the tiredness of his soldiers. "Capture that, the Cross Island Road, and we'll bring up your breakfast," he said to Colonel Hamilton of the 307th. The 307th did, and Bruce sent forth Japanese candy and salmon that had been captured. The Reservoir Battle. The 77th had nearly arrived at Pago Bay by dusk on July 31st. The Army arrived at the East Coast on August 1st. The 307th arrived at and captured the Agana-Pago Bay Road at midday. Geiger had both of his divisions ready for the last attack by the evening of August 7th. The Leathernecks also respected the 77th, and they now refer to it as the 77 Mar Div, which is a great honor. The 77th demonstrated combat efficiency to a degree one would only expect from veteran troops, according to Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith. The result was obvious, as only a third of the island needed to be freed. Geiger's strategy was to wage his battle in a way that would minimize American deaths. The village of Barrigada, which possessed a massive reservoir that could pump 2,000 gallons of water each day, was his next target. The next significant engagement for the 77th Division would be the Battle of the Reservoir. Slow progress was maintained. On August 2nd, Bruce threw his 2 regiments forward and encountered difficulties. There was machine gun fire that stopped the 307. One conflict centered on a 2-story greenhouse and a recently constructed Buddhist temple. At 1:30 p.m., Bruce authorized a combined infantry, tank, and artillery attack, but it was unsuccessful. By the end of the day, the 77th had lost 125 men and failed to meet their goals. The next day, things got better. A marching barrage came before the 307th's riflemen on August 3rd, and 3 hours after they advanced, they captured the Barrigada Well. By mid-afternoon, the 307 had ascended Mount Barrigada. The careful, gradual advance continued the following day. But disaster struck when Marines from 2-9 and tanks from the 307th switched fire due to a signal blunder. The Marines' own artillery fired on 2306, causing panic on August 8th. Guam's highest-ranking casualty, Colonel Douglas McNair. However, it was now evident that the Japanese were giving up the majority of the strong defensive positions and were retreating to a final stand on Mount Santa Rosa in the northeast corner of the island. On August 5th, the Army battled their way up and down slick pathways through some of Guam's harshest jungles while it poured rain. Leading the charge, searching for sniper fire, were tanks and tank destroyers. The 305th had advanced 2,000 yards before evening. 1305 made an unsuccessful attempt to dig foxholes among the coral that evening. Naturally, a platoon of infantrymen and 2 Japanese medium tanks attacked the battalion's A company. The Americans shot down the troops, but the rivet-hulled tanks were harder for their machine guns to hit. The tanks thundered past the perimeter into the company area, and the bazooka troops failed as well. The tanks withdrew unharmed after a few minutes of flares and shelling, leaving behind 15 dead and 46 wounded, 33 of whom had to be evacuated. The following day, E Company of the 2305 encountered the 2 tanks on the area's sole trail. When the Americans moved forward, the tanks were in defilade and opened fire on the trail's trees. The jungle terrain made it impossible for Shermans to get close to the enemy. The Japanese crews were forced to ditch their tanks as the Americans raised heavy machine guns and 81mm mortars, leaving 3 dead in exchange for 16 Americans who were killed and 32 injured. Colonel Douglas McNair, the Chief of Staff of the 77th Division, established a new divisional command post around 600 yards south of the settlement of Ipapau on August 6th. About 200 yards down the route, McNair spotted a little cottage and decided to check it out. McNair was instantly killed by a single gunshot, fired by a sniper concealed within the structure. The highest-ranking American officer slain in the conflict was McNair. 2 weeks prior, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed in the European theater, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the father of McNair, had been killed by friendly fire in Normandy while leading Army ground forces. Bruce gave the order for 3-305 to do a thorough sweep. Just a third of a mile from the intended divisional command post, the Americans discovered 150 Japanese. Bruce arrived quickly to back his 2 assault troops with a platoon of Sherman tanks. The combat lasted 6 hours before the location was captured. Taking it slowly around the Yigo Mount Santa Rosa region. The 77th Division was now advancing on the Yigo Mount Santa Rosa fortifications, the last Japanese stronghold in the area. Amid the typical dense foliage, Yigo was a small settlement at a crossroads of narrow roads, yet Mount Santa Rosa was actually only 800 feet high. The mountain was subjected to direct bombardment for days when the Navy arrived on August 3rd, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The primary goal was to reach the Yigo Mount Santa Rosa region by the 77th. Bruce's strategy called for the division to make a 90-degree turn in its advance axis. With the assistance of an accompanying company of tanks from the 706th Tank Battalion, the 306th would advance along the left edge of the division. It would head east after reaching Mount Santa Rosa and take control of the region north of the mountain. With the support of the remaining 706th Tank Battalion, the 307th would capture Yigo and then block the west slopes of Mount Santa Rosa. To block off the southern slopes, the 305th would be on the right, supporting the 307th. On August 7th, all 3 regiments took off at 7 a.m. Supported by the customary heavy bombardment of Army and Navy fire, the attack on Yigo began at noon. In order for the tanks to be ready to lead the assault, Bruce's plan called for the barrage to stop exactly at noon. The tanks arrived at the front of the infantry column 20 minutes late. They encountered an ambush after sweeping forward and eliminating Japanese machine gun positions. 2 of the tanks were torn apart by Japanese fire as the M5s ascended a modest incline. Behind them, the Shermans moved into action, but one halted and another threw a track. Fire from rifles and machine guns pinned down the Americans. Although the infantry was still hemmed down, the tanks managed to go past the obstacles and enter Yigo. Commanding 306, Lieutenant Gordon Kimbrough acted swiftly, splitting up a platoon to advance into the jungle and capture the defenders in the rear. His move was flawless. The onslaught resumed after the Americans destroyed the strongpoint. The onslaught, however, was proceeding slowly. By evening, Yigo had been captured, and the 307th had advanced 1,000 yards beyond the settlement. Tank infantry cooperation helped the 306th gain its foothold. A platoon of tanks was assigned to the infantry lead company. With one tank protecting the back, these positioned themselves on either side of the route. They defeated Japanese machine gunners in the process. On the right, the 305th blazed a track with bulldozers. The final Japanese infantry and tank attack. The Japanese attempted their standard tactic of infiltrating the Americans in the early evening, but were routed. Along the road north of Yigo, the 3306 was the target of the campaign's final Japanese tank infantry onslaught. The Americans were attacked by Japanese infantry and 3 tanks. As the tanks blasted shells into the nearby trees, the troops pinned down the American bazooka crews. The crew of one tank was killed when the GIs fired a small machine gun into its 6,000 10-inch forward aperture. The second tank's flimsy armor was torn apart by a rifle grenade. One of the damaged tanks was hauled away by the third. 6 Americans were killed and 16 injured by the Japanese, who also lost at least 18 people. In the face of waning Japanese opposition, the 306th began the ascent up the trail to Lulog village early on August 8th. As the 306th advanced to within a few hundred yards of the water, they killed over 100 Japanese. 35 Japanese were killed as the 307th trudged its way to the top of Mount Santa Rosa. They discovered no enemy, and at 2 p.m. the regiment's commander, Lieutenant Cole Thomas Manuel, was standing atop its peak. At a manageable cost of 30 killed and 104 wounded, Bruce could see from his charts at twilight that his division had accomplished all of its goals in the northern sector of Guam, while also accounting for 528 Japanese casualties. The absence of the 2,000 Japanese men who were supposed to be at Mount Santa Rosa was the sole issue. The 3rd Marine Division, which was also making a steady and methodical advance, had trouble with that. The Honor Medal for Frank Wietek. With the 3rd Marines on the left and the 9th Marines on the right, both regiments aligned with the 77th Division. The Marine push started at 6:30 a.m. on August 2nd. Only 1 mile had been gained by dark as the Marines struggled to make headway through the thick foliage. The 1st Provisional Brigade was enjoying some respite as the 3rd Division made progress. Few Japanese defenders were being discovered by patrols to the south. The largest group was a group of roughly 12 people who were holed up in a cave close to Mount Lamlam. In order for the 1st Provisional Brigade to advance on the far left of the line in the last push into northern Guam, Geiger moved it forward to a position behind the 3rd Division's defenses on August 3rd. The 3rd Marine Division onslaught persisted that day. Despite some resistance, the 3rd Marine Regiment left at 7 a.m. and traveled 3,000 yards before dusk. Just before Junction 177, the 9th Marines encountered a company-sized Japanese regiment that was dug in on both sides of the Finegaian-Santa Rosa Road. By 10 a.m., Marines from B Company had taken the position, supported by tanks and heavy weaponry. They reported 105 enemy casualties. The 9th Marines encountered more difficult resistance at Junction 177, about 500 yards ahead. In order to blend in with the thick foliage, Japanese soldiers placed their machine guns in ditches and ravines. The bravery of Marine PFC, age 23. The Japanese defenses were breached with Frank Wietek's assistance. Wietek was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. In front of 5,000 spectators at Soldier Field in Chicago on Sunday, May 20th, 1945, Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Van de Grift gave the medal to Wietek's mother. Combat in the region of Finegaian. Turnage dispatched his division's reconnaissance company to Retidian Point at 8 a.m. Company A of the Marines' 3rd Tank Battalion and Company VC of 321 joined the reconnaissance mission later that day. This ad hoc group was commanded by Lieutenant Kohler Hartnell Withers of the Tank Battalion. Immediately things went wrong. First, there was not enough fuel for the task force to get back home. The lead vehicle then proceeded eastward into enemy lines, missing the crucial left turn and colliding with Japanese fire. Tanks, machine guns, and 75mm and 105mm field pieces supported the defending Imperial Marines. As their tanks tore through the Japanese defenses, the Leathernecks sought shelter. The Japanese used patrols in the 9th Marines area, flares, and mortar fire to keep the Marines hot that night. With the 21st Marine Regiment in the middle and gaining momentum against little opposition, the Marines regrouped their forces on August 4th. The 3rd Marines advanced the following day, reaching 1,000 yards, despite encountering more obstacles from the forest than the Germans. The 9th Marines and their 2 accompanying tank platoons encountered Japanese resistance backed by 75mm guns, while the 21st Marines also made easy progress. By evening, the Marines had almost reached the settlement of Liguan and had raised a tank destroyer to destroy the Japanese. However, the news wasn't all positive. With no connection to the Army's 77th Infantry Division, the Marine right flank was suspended in mid-air. Turnage and Geiger were concerned about their exposed flank. But the Japanese were nearing the end of their patience. They defended the Finagayan area, where they still had some artillery pieces and strong observation points, in their final effort to repel the Marines. Important American road intersections could be hit by Japanese shelling. Turnage gave his Marines orders to focus on the roads and trails on August 6th. After 3 miles of advance, the Marines united their front lines. On August 7th, the 4th Marines moved north for Junction 460, 4 miles south of Retidian Point, the northernmost point of Guam, while the 1st Provisional Brigade assumed control of the Marines' left flank. On a northeastern axis, the 3rd Marine Division moved 3 miles the same day. Guam is safe. With the 22nd Marines on the left flank, Shepard's brigade started its advance at 7:30 a.m. on August 8th, cautiously following the devastation inflicted by Navy and Marine artillery. First to arrive on Guam's northern shore was Company F of 222. The Japanese were relocating to the island's northeastern region by August 9th and 10, and the Americans were becoming frustrated with the enemy's pursuit. 5 Japanese tanks that had breached 223's lines on the evening of August 8th were not located. They had probably been abandoned after making a full escape. The Marines gave up their last drive toward the northeast on August 9th, after hearing from Guamanians that there were 3,000 Japanese nearby. This seemed more like a task for Marine artillery. For 2.5 hours, the heavy guns fired 4,000 rounds into the suspected region. The Army advanced in tandem with the Marines. The reconnaissance company of the 77th Division was delayed down by strong Japanese fortifications. Therefore, on August 10th, the 1306ers advanced with more weaponry. 8 GIs were killed and 17 were wounded, as the Americans raised flamethrowers and were confronted with rifle and machine gun fire. The Americans made the decision to strike the Japanese harder the following day. The 1306 used machine gun fire, mortars, and flamethrowers to attack the caverns and trenches on the 11th. Just prior to the arrival of Generals Vandegrift and Holland Smith, as well as Admirals Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance, to assess the campaign's progress, Geiger declared Guam secure at 11:30 a.m. on August 10th. Geiger was able to state that 77 American casualties had been reported, compared to 84 Japanese deaths. Of these, 1190 Marines had been killed, 377 wounded, and 308 injured. During its drive north, the Army had suffered 662 injuries and 177 fatalities. Even though they posed no organized threat to the American forces, the more than 7,000 Japanese soldiers who were still holed up in Guam's bush were nonetheless able to kill Americans. The final Japanese soldier gives up. Engineers from the Army, Navy, and Marines occupied the island and established extensive air and naval bases on a formerly underutilized region of the American Empire. The U.S. Forward Headquarters was founded by Nimitz himself. There is the Pacific Fleet. From the Marianas, huge fleets of B-29s roared to destroy the cities of Japan, but for weeks, the fight to protect the island went on. In order to persuade ardent defenders to surrender, the Americans used a carrot-and-stick strategy, dropping Japanese psychological warfare pamphlets from the sky throughout the day. U.S. patrols killed an average of 80 Japanese per day in August, and as late as February 1945, only 44 detainees were taken, despite 141 Japanese being killed that month. Amazingly, a few Japanese managed to survive. Up until his eventual capitulation on June 11th, 1945, a Major Sato and his 34 soldiers continued to operate in southern Guam. 2 days after Japan's capitulation in Tokyo Bay, on September 4, 1945, Takeda and a party of 67 men would finally surrender. Japanese recalcitrants refused to humiliate themselves by giving up. Tadashi Ito and Bunzo Minagawa, two fugitives, turned themselves up in 1960. Despite their assistance, local officials were unable to locate any other holdouts. It was assumed that Guam had at last been freed. No, it wasn't. Two Guamanian fishermen, Jesus Dueñas and Manuel de Gracia, set out to check their shrimp traps along a tiny river near Talafofo on the evening of January 24, 1972, 28 years after Geiger had pronounced Guam secure. A scrawny man rushed from the forest. He was subdued by the two Guamanians. Once in the custody of Guamanian authorities, the individual was identified as 38th Infantry Regiment Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, who had been officially declared dead since 1955.